Hi everyone, it's Guillaume from Startup Basecamp. Welcome to the Tech for Climate podcast. During the show, you will have the opportunity to meet the best climate tech founders, investors, and experts from both Silicon Valley and around the globe. They will share with you their stories and personal journeys into this growing and exciting industry, giving you some insight into the ecosystems that help you to take part in the fight against climate change and benefit from the opportunities it can represent. The podcast is divided in two small interviews. During the first part, you will get to know our speakers, their perspectives on the climate crisis and how climate tech is changing the game. The second part of the discussion will be for members of our community who will learn the speakers' secret sauce on how to and share with you their unique expertise on topics such as fundraising, management, strategy, and so on, to help you to become a better leader in your field. So before we start, I would like to quickly share what we are doing at Startup Basecamp to support climate tech founders in accessing resources and gaining visibility with investors they seek. Our initiatives include a membership-based community platform offering access to a dedicated Slack group with a growing number of founders, experts, and investors from around the world, and a series of exclusive content such as interviews, weekly job listings, events, and our quarterly online pitch of night opportunity. But more than a place where you can learn, exchange, and grow, we are building a matchmaking service to facilitate connections between our members and top investors and experts in the field. And soon, alongside with other top investors, we will be launching a small fund to co-invest in the growth and acceleration of our members. Finally, all of this is possible because of your support and donations. We are a small self-funded team, and we want you to be part of this collective movement against climate change. So please share one episode with a friend and subscribe to the channels. As an added bonus, we will plant a tree for each of our subscribers each time we reach 1,000 new fans or donors. Do not hesitate to connect with me via social media or email guillaume@startupbasecamp. Thanks a lot for listening. I hope to get in touch with you soon. And now, let's go for the show. Hi everybody, during this new episode of Founder Series, we are sitting down with Kelly Herring, CTO and co-founder at Charm Industrial. Charm Industrial, which is one of the fastest growing carbon removal technology companies, is on a mission to return the atmosphere to 280 ppm CO2. To do this, they are taking cellulosic biomass, which already captures 100 plus gigaton CO2 per year, and is turning it into a bio-oil before injecting it underground to store it for millennia. I was excited to speak with Kelly, a Brown-educated mechanical engineer who is not only passionate about building things, but also about women's studies and getting more women involved in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. Prior to Charm Industrial, Kelly designed satellites at Planet, a leading provider in global satellite imagery, and worked as a rocket designer at Astra, both of which gave her invaluable experience in iterative design and bringing tech to market quickly. In this episode, we will learn more about Charm's unique process for capturing carbon and storing it permanently, where they sit in the current carbon offset market and who their big buyers are. Together, we will also cover how the market is ensuring CO2 offsets are certified or insured, and what the real impact carbon offsetting could or should have in the fight against climate change. We will also go deeper into Charm and how they select the biomass they use for their processes, where they store their carbon, and their business model. During the second part of the talk, Kelly will share her thoughts on the warlike effort needed to channel the climate crisis, as well as what she has learned from her co-founders during Charm's fundraising journey. Finally, she will share a secret and tips for founders trying to maintain a healthy work-life balance. Kelly, welcome to the show. Hi Kelly, welcome to the Tech for Climate podcast. I'm super happy and excited to have you here with us today. I believe it's going to be a great opportunity to hear your story and learn more about what you guys are up to with Charm Industrial. So welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me.
First question, as usual, Before we start, can you give us a 30-second introduction about Charm Industrial?
Sure. So Charm Industrial, um, basically our mission is to reduce the global CO2 concentrations to 280 parts per million CO2. And we've developed currently two pathways to do that. And so it starts with we produce a bio oil, which comes from some amount of plant matter. So we process plant matter in a machine that we've built, which then produces bio oil. And that bio oil then can be used for two purposes. One is a carbon removal pathway. So that's actually taking that bio oil and pumping it back underground, which is something that we've developed and invented over the last few years. And then the other pathway, we can actually gasify it through another machine that we've designed into syngas, which is a mixture of gases that can be used to decarbonize heavy industry. And that's specifically targeting steel production right now. And so Charm is basically developing these technical pathways to try to reduce global CO2 concentrations.
That's super exciting. So let's start from the top. Can you tell us a bit more about your personal story, background? What are you passionate about? I know that you love to build Charm Industrial, and that's probably taking a lot of your time. But what makes you feel like inspired or like your best self? As I always ask, who's Kelly?
Yeah, awesome. Yeah. So let's see. My background, I grew up in New Jersey and then went to school for mechanical engineering. And that's where I went to school at Brown in Rhode Island. And what's really cool about Brown is that it has a very like liberal arts degree where you can both be in the sciences and engineering and also be in kind of a mixed liberal arts environment. And so that really allowed me to kind of take to both of my passions. So I was able to develop a lot about mechanical engineering, which was really driven from my desire to just like build things and understand how humans interact with like the things in our environment and how like as a human myself and an engineer I could actually impact that environment. And then on top of that, I was always really interested in women's studies and specifically how you get women into like technical and science fields. As someone who's obviously been in the industry for a few years, or I guess more than a few years at this point, young at heart, I guess. the it's been a really eye-opening experience to just be a woman in the industry and how we can create environments for people to really feel comfortable and be their best selves and produce some really incredible things from a diverse background and or gender or whatever it may be. And so I've been really excited about figuring out ways to get more women to STEM and to like also really inspire others, younger people in science and in climate specifically now. So those are some of the things that I'm inspired by. And then also on my free time, I guess my partner and I do a lot of like immersive art type of things. So we enjoy kind of making experiences and kind of bringing a little bit of weirdness to the world. So
That's exciting. Can you give us maybe one example of this kind of immersion that you do?
yeah, sure. So we built let's see, we went to Disneyland a few years back, and when you stay late, right, you can see the water. I think it's like it's either Fantasia or they do some different things, but basically they like create these water screens out of this like complex engineered water system that they have at Disney World, and they project onto them. And so we wanted to do this for an event, and so we actually created one in the middle of a river with a raft and some pumps and things like that, and we projected on from behind, and so you can actually, if you imagine at night, all of a sudden the river kind of like comes alive, and then you see like projections of things like coming out of the river and things like that. So we kind of brought that to that event in a natural way because we're all camping, but like all of a sudden you would just see this projection of water come out of the river nearby.
This is pretty exciting. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
So, out of this whole story, and you mentioned that you were in the tech industry prior to being in the climate tech industry, I would say. Uh, Out of all of those like work and life experience prior to the launch of Charm Industrial, what did you learn along the way that, in a way, you would not have if you had a different journey? I mean, and that him maybe gave you an edge today to start Charm Industrial?
Yeah, I definitely think that my experiences leading up once I left college were really impactful in starting Charm. So I left college. I was working on a CubeSat project in college. That's like building a small satellite about the size of actually like a tissue box. So the satellite was actually used to encourage people to get interested in space. So it had these blinking lights on it that you could actually see from the ground with the naked eye. And so I was working on CubeSats, and then I actually got connected with someone who was doing commercial CubeSats in San Francisco, trying to do that for good and like basically create a base map of the entire Earth every day using these small satellites that had been working on for years in college, and then use those for good to count trees, to like to see human effects on the Earth on the human timescales as opposed to seeing them on for like year long time scales or some of the other data sets. So I started there as an intern, and then we basically we were developing these satellites in like a rapid iterative way, and I got to really see that process from end to end and build these satellites and grow the team. And so we saw the team grow from like 20 to hundreds of people, and then got the opportunity, and then eventually left there after like gathering all of that stuff about how you take this really slow moving industry, which is space, and go into this like new space industry. So moving it into this rapid iterative like startup world that the satellites don't have to cost millions of dollars. They don't have to take years to make. We can actually like make them much more cost efficient, much quicker. And then we were just like churning out satellite after satellite because they were small and modular. And so then I went to a company called Astra for about a little over a year, where we were doing the same thing for rockets. So instead of building these giant rockets, we were building smaller modular rockets, about 40 feet tall roughly, to take up these CubeSats. So that was kind of the connecting thing for me. So while I wasn't designing parts for these little things, and they were much bigger, in at least in the way that I had experienced design before, they still had that approach of like, how do you do it quickly, using off the shelf components, using things that don't have to go through this like crazy rigor um, of like a design process because of the fact that they were built so quickly, so disposably almost, because they were so small and quick to be made. So when it came to starting Charm, and my co-founders reached out to me about that process, and it was really a good opportunity to go back to this mission-driven organization. Planet was that, right? The Planet had this like
Yeah.
background in trying to do good with data. Astra was super cool in the fact that I got to design and build a rocket in a year. But it didn't. Its mission was to help get satellites to space, right? And then when I got a chance to start Charm, it was like you get to actually work on something that was so critically important for climate. And so bringing all of that experience from that modular design and build allows us to now look at the chemical industry, look at some of these industries that have been around for a bit, but they haven't really gotten a lot of traction, and try to understand where the gaps were and how we can use iterative design to learn things very quickly and not fall into similar traps. And then also just like bring technology to market much quicker. And so that's kind of that transition for me. And it's been exciting to deploy those skills.
So in all of this, and it sounds that you mentioned that this for good that the planet in a way was was carrying as a mission behind just the fact of just the fact of building a satellite. What was your driver to jump into the climate tech industry? Any specific aha moment that you can recall or would define as such, or is it a succession, or what has been like this little like ignite moment, or where you say, okay, this is where I want to put my entire life and soul for now for the next 5-10 years? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that um, we're probably one of the first like age group or generation that has really grown up seeing or hearing about climate change as a concept from like I think I first heard about it in second grade. We had someone come in and basically tell us that all of this like our cities would be underwater because like well the sea level rise and all this stuff, and I remember it being absolutely terrifying and like debilitating almost, from that perspective. Probably could have been worded better for a second grader, but we're one of the first generations who have really heard about it as a fundamental problem. And going throughout our lives, we also haven't seen much action on the part of our government representatives. Like we've seen kind of these big concepts at these different like global events, right, where we want to like keep the temperature rise below 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius and all those things. But I hadn't really ever seen from an engineering perspective the opportunity to get into that space, especially as a mechanical engineer. A lot of the time you hear chemical engineering as like this way to work on fuels or to work on green energy. You don't really hear about it as like the mechanical engineer can do something there. And so I think when the concept was brought up is like, could you support in the design of this kind of new way of thinking about chemical plants, and how do we build hardware, like how do we like take atoms and turn them into things that help the planet? All of a sudden it like clicked for me that as a mechanical engineer, I actually have something to contribute beyond, it didn't have to be limited by chemistry. And pyrolysis, which is the kind of the backbone chemical process of charm industrial, has been around since the 80s, and that's not something that like I needed to be an expert in to contribute to the production of this effectively. And so now all of a sudden I was like, oh, I can see how my skills are directly like impactful, and that debilitating feeling of like you can't do anything because you didn't pick the right field or you didn't have the right skill set is now something where I'm like, I need more mechanical engineers. How many mechanical engineers can I hire in a given amount of time to just like make stuff and to design and build and like partner with the chemists or partner with other types of engineers to just like push things forward.
So, out of curiosity, because I mean you're based in Silicon Valley, San Francisco, and so do you see that some engineers like you, or software engineers, or maybe like business people from the traditional tech ecosystem trying to move into the climate tech or want to do something? Do you see like a movement there, or is more like something that here and there happens, but most of the other people are focused on building different solutions right now?
Yeah, I definitely have seen some movement into it. Not necessarily in the hardware space, though. I think that there's a certain barrier that we've been finding to people coming into hardware because of the natural thought that like they can't contribute in certain ways. Um, and the people in the hardware space, I think maybe don't, I think are still experiencing that thing I just talked about, which is like, where are my skills directly transferable into something? So I've seen a lot of like hardware people in the like autonomous vehicles of the world, or in the like space industry, or those types of things, and less in moving into climate tech. Whereas I've seen a lot of software people and business people who are excited about it start to go into it, but then only see themselves in a software solution. So they're working a lot on how do you trade carbon offsets? How do you value them? How do you, like, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here. So how do you
No
trade
worries.
carbon offsets? How do you value them? How do you measure them? How do you make things slightly more efficient from a software perspective, and less from a like atoms, like actually building stuff that, or contributing on a software level or on a business level to things that could actually remove CO2 from the atmosphere.
So before we start going into detail of charm industrial, I'd like to zoom out, and as I was mentioning prior to the interview, I'd like to kind of understand like the overall context that charm is navigating on. I mean, on one side you have the biomass agricultural waste landscape that you guys are valorizing in a way. On the other side you have the carbon offset market, and we always like want to dig a little bit more onto the carbon offset landscape. Would love to get your overview of it. I mean, what are the challenges that you can see and opportunities in the market? I mean, who are the main players that you came across? Maybe the main buyer, and I saw that your buyers are quite well known, so that's exciting to see that those type of companies are moving into the market. how efficient is that market? Do you see any like blocking point to go mainstream in a way? Uh, I believe there's two questions here.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so I guess the first of the two, in terms of where we are in that market and kind of how we entered that. So initially, we were looking at kind of a BECS solution, and BECS is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. When Charm started, we were going from biomass all the way to hydrogen. We were like, all right, we're going to target this like hydrogen market, which is growing, but very established, right? Like we knew that um, there is a known buyer of hydrogen. They like have specific load needs, and it was about how we were going to get our tech into a space where it could like produce at those levels in renewable ways. Um, as we started to shift kind of Charm's um, eventual pathway that we decided to choose, we moved a little bit away from the hydrogen market because a like producing biomass for hydrogen, it just creates not as pure of a hydrogen stream, which is like so important to the hydrogen market. So we actually were like, all right, well, maybe we could actually target the syngas market, which is a mixture of gases, and reduce a lot of the cost of the cleanup stages required just for hydrogen. So there's still hydrogen in our syngas, but we don't have to make pure hydrogen from it. And could we become value there? And so then we access this other market, which is heavy industry, and and decarbonizing that generally. However, that also requires a very large throughput of syngas, right? So what you have to do then is start 10 years ahead, making and proving out and making these long-term deals with these very heavy industry, very established, very large companies, and work your way slowly up and showing them all the tech and making deals about what the next plant looks like and what it can provide, and all the while like trying to make sure that it's hitting their specifications. What is really tricky about that is that you need a lot of funding along the way, and in a very like massive amounts of funding along the way. So starting there as a company, you just know you have to take this very long pathway, and we don't have time to solve climate in that way. Like we need carbon removal solutions that aren't going to come in like 20 years from now and be scalable in 20 years. We need climate solutions that actually start to remove CO2 as soon as possible. So basically what we found when we discovered the bio-oil sequestration pathway was that we could immediately access the carbon removal or carbon offsets type of market and get funding not just from our investors, but from the actual marketplace in order to scale our tech. And that there were people who were willing to invest in that, like Stripe and Shopify and Microsoft, along the way by basically paying a premium for that carbon removal. And so ours are much more expensive. Our offsets are much more expensive than other companies. However, they also come with this kind of commitment that we are like trying our like with everything that we've got to produce more and more of this bio oil, to scale our hardware, and to like get down that cost curve as quickly as possible for those customers, in like with the expectation that they will support us along the way in doing so. And so while these very established markets are like have all of that like under like they're understood, there's a process, there's some funding, but it usually very much encompasses a lot of like government subsidies and things of that nature. We now have this much more quick market that is able to react and support, and that's the carbon removal market that we've been seeing from people who are doing net zero commitments. When it comes to the issues with that being mainstream or the like efficiency of that market, I think that there is still a fundamental problem of like how you value a carbon offset and what the quality of that offset is when it comes to permanence. So a lot of the time they see a carbon offset that is ours that's like $600 a ton that is permanent on 10,000 year plus timescales, and try to compare that with nature-based solutions that are $5 to $20 a ton, but might only be permanent on 1 to 100-year timescales. And so without being able to have that conversation in a very objective way, we both know that we want both, but they're fundamentally different, but are constantly being compared.
So how does the market today ensure, or I would say certified, that the quantity of CO2 offset that has been purchased will be, or in your case, have been effectively taken out of the air? I mean, can you tell us a bit more about like what's the constraint and like what you guys had to go through to certify it and comply to that, or is it something that's still very case by case basis?
Yeah, I would say it's still very case by case basis. But it's kind of it's on the buyer and the seller of that offset to agree on kind of what that means. And so for us, there are like certification bodies around, but they're not necessarily like prepared for new technologies like charm. So we don't just like fit nicely into like the setup, right? So we can't just be like, oh, here's a lot of the times when they do nature-based offsets, it's like they're trying to map it to a piece of satellite data with a known location on the globe, right? That's a little bit different for us because they're not going to be able to track bio-oil sequestration with satellite data. So the way that it's currently done for us is that we work with several of our customers. Well, I think the main players like Stripe and Shopify and Microsoft have their own due diligence and scientific teams that are doing that initial diligence on our product and what we plan to do. And then when we do a delivery, there's an agreed upon showing us the steps of how we got that carbon, how it was processed, and then where it was, basically the injection certificates for where that carbon went underground, and then making sure that all of the carbon is accounted for on either side of that. And so in the initial step, we give every customer an LCA or a life cycle analysis of our process to say like, okay, this is where we expect all of the carbon accounting is. And then we have to follow up on that LCA afterwards. We're saying like, okay, this is actually what happened. And so therefore this amount of carbon was removed net after all the processing that went into it.
Okay, so to close this section, like as I was mentioning, like there's always like some controversy around like carbon offsetting in itself. So according to you and your personal opinion, what is the real impact of carbon offsetting on climate change? I mean, why does it need to exist, or is it more like a buzz or greenwashing tool that in a way big emitters can leverage to look better?
Right. I think that it definitely has to exist for the climate, right? We know that in order to achieve the 1.5 degree limit, they're saying that we need somewhere on the order of 5 to 20 gigatons every year removed. So that's different than reduction and different than decarbonization, but rather like we need to actually go remove historical emissions. And so that's why it's like fundamentally important. However, I do think that without the quality conversations, without the like real intensive look at some of the government subsidies and who's using them. Like for right now, we have like one federal in the US, one federal government subsidy called 45Q that really is only able to be accessed by EOR or oil and gas companies. So all of these climate solutions want to access this 45Q, can't, because we're like there's different reasons why we're excluded from the law. So it's like in that respect, yeah, like the government's doing something, but if it's only aiding oil and gas companies, like are we really doing anything about it? And so it's things like that where you like unless we have a really good agreed upon baseline of language, of quality, of verification, and of like expectation or like understanding of what's actually being utilized in these different like efforts towards offsetting, then it's going to be hard to evaluate whether or not somebody is just greenwashing or somebody is actually doing something.
So let's go back to Charm Industrial and let's go deeper into the story. I mean, what is the story behind it? I mean, and which are the gaps that you guys identified at first that in a way led to the current version of Charm? why Charm Industrial had to exist in a way.
Yeah, so my co-founders had some time initially looking into what are carbon solutions, what are the most efficient ones, where have there been gaps in the way that traditional climate tech has been attempted that didn't allow them to be successful, because there was that whole kind of green energy and like green bubble that existed that just never that popped and never really became climate solutions that we know today and what happened in each of those. So digging deeper into all of those, there was definitely technical hurdles that I think were seen too late, and then there were business hurdles that I think were like insurmountable in the current approach that they had been taking. So that could be from a like scaling perspective and like the costs around it and the slowness of some of the subsidies and the expectations around the subsidies and so on and so forth. So initially, we decided to go forward with producing biomass or using biomass, like plant matter, agricultural waste, to produce hydrogen. And then we immediately started developing a system to do that. So that was kind of my job and my co-founder Sean's job. And then while Peter, other co-founder, was really deep in seeing what the opportunities were on the business side, getting the proper funding and getting the life cycle analysis that I mentioned really worked out for that process. And so as we dug deeper into it, we really found that biomass, very light and fluffy, very expensive, both from a carbon perspective and a cost perspective to transport. Hydrogen, also light and fluffy, not only dangerous to transport, but also like not super cost effective and is difficult to transport generally. So then we were like, okay, well, we know that we have a problem here with transport on both ends. So what if we eliminated that transport and said, okay, well, we'll put half of our machine, the one that produces bio-oil, even though we had an end-to-end machine, we just had this bio-oil that was like in between that we had to deal with, and it was really like a tar problem, and that's typical to a lot of the companies who have dealt with biomass, is like there's always a tar problem. We were like, okay, well, this tar problem exists and this transport problem exists, so what if we split it? We embrace the tar problem and we design for it and say, instead of it being a tar problem, it's a tar benefit. So we say, we'll go to the site of the field where the biomass is. We'll make these small modular units so we can unconstrain our like radius of biomass that is like usually constraining for these big plants, and process the biomass and into bio-oil there. Then we take and we optimize for the bio-oil. We take that bio-oil, very heavy, much more cost effective to ship, and we ship that to the plant that produces the hydrogen. And then we don't have to ship the hydrogen, and that's a point of load, great and happy. So that was kind of our first breakthrough. And then our second breakthrough was, second, like two different breakthroughs kind of combined in this next one. But one of them was to go from hydrogen to syngas, which I mentioned earlier, based on the fact that we knew that our purity from bio-oil gasification was never going to be as good as some of these. We were going to have trouble competing with electrolysis. Maybe in the future we can. I don't know. But we knew that like syngas was going to be that area. And then my co-founder Sean had the revelation that if we think about carbon removal not just as CO2 removal, but as pure carbon removal, that this bio-oil, which we thought had a really high value in its energy content, actually has a higher value of its carbon content. And the pyrolysis producer, like the people who have done commercial pyrolysis around the world, a lot in Europe, some in Canada, they've been trying to optimize for bio-oil as a fuel. And bio-oil is many things. It is unstable. It is full of random hydrocarbons. And unstable from a perspective of like it likes to solidify. So like if you imagine fuel, like you don't want it to solidify on you. That's like not great for your engines and things. And so the things that we needed for the bio-oil to be a successful fuel, we didn't need it all for it to go underground. We actually could embrace some of the problems that bio-oil had as being a fuel and instead use them as like an injectant. And so that's where that breakthrough was like, how can we harness this for its carbon content? And then going through that pathway, we were like, okay, now we've realized that we have an opportunity here to do permanent carbon removal. And all of our applications to Stripe's RFPs and things like that, which we were like, hydrogen, was like, okay, no, this is actually so much better. Like, look at the life cycle analysis, look at what we can do, even on really short time scales. That is really exciting for climate generally.
So speaking about the biomass, I mean, I guess you guys are using the waste or side product of the agricultural process in itself. So is it? I mean, your process, your pyrolysis, is it working with any type of biomass, or do you have like ones that you can say this is the one that works the best? Is there any selection that you do there? How do you ensure that in a way is the best one? I was wondering like if people pays you to use that as well, or to get this biomass out of their field or whatever, or maybe what was the typical use of that biomass before you guys came along?
Sure. So traditionally, biomass has always been done with wood. It's typically been co-located with like sawmills or something like that to utilize excess sawdust. Wood is great for biomass processing. It's like it has very low ash, which is the thing that really drives the complications of the process. So low ash means you get a much higher yield, and it's much more of an efficient process. But you don't get that luxury when it comes to agricultural waste. You get a lot of ash, mostly because it's dirt, right? It's in the soil, um, and it's in the plant matter too. And so corn stover and wheat straw, which we're also using right now, um, has a much higher ash content. So it's not necessarily optimized for the yield or for like the process efficiency, but rather for the fact that it does exist in large quantities and we want to make sure that our machines can handle them. So instead of just sticking with wood and knowing that that's the best, we do want to be able to process all types of biomass and in fact start at some of the hardest ones so we learn those lessons as soon as possible. So right now we're focused on corn stover because it's even harder than wheat straw in the fact that not only do you have this like straw leafy type of material, which is also a lot different to process than wood, but you also have corn cobs like randomly throughout. So you have to deal with all of the chaos that comes with the variety of things that you get in a bale of corn. And then traditionally, what it's done, like what was used for in the past, most of the time, so you have a lot of excess biomass that will either be burned just to remove it. It could also be like left in the field to rot, and they usually do leave some in the field in order to prevent soil erosion, and we encourage that. And then the remainder is like at times used for animal feed, but it's usually low protein and doesn't really have all of those things. So if there's any scenario in which it would be used for a different purpose other than rotting or basically being returned to the atmosphere, you do have to account for that in your LCA. So we're looking typically at agricultural waste that wouldn't be used for anything else, and also like forestry waste from forest thinning operations and all that excess things that don't have another use case effectively.
And just out of curiosity, when it goes through your process and through the digester or the pyrolysis in itself, so you extract on one side the oil, but on the other side, I mean, I guess you have some residual like dry piece. So what else comes out, and what do you do, and how do you deal with that extract after?
Yeah, great question. So the process produces three different things. So it produces the bio-oil, which we've been talking about,
Yeah.
and then it produces a syngas. So similar to also what we've been discussing, a mixture of gases that can be used for power and for heating.
Yeah.
And then it also produces a biochar, which we collect and then hopefully plan to return to the fields for both nutrient and soil carbon. We're not like we're not accounting for that yet in terms of our like carbon removal because we do believe that there's a little bit more work to be done about soil carbon and how permanent it is and things of that nature. But right now we're just kind of at those early stages of collecting it. Sometimes we'll get it pelleted. Some systems will actually use it for heat and they'll burn it. We don't currently do that. We're just currently looking into how we can best partner with farmers to do experiments on how it's good for their soil or not, depending on how those go.
So let's move on the storage side. I mean, like, how do you define, like, the place where to store it? What is a good, spot? Because you guys claim that it's for 1,000,000 years. It's gonna stay under the ground, so which is pretty exciting. It reminds me a little bit what Carb Fix does back in I think it's like Greenland or something like that. With big. Yeah, exactly. So how do you select like the type of soil that is suitable for injecting, and how is the process working?
Yeah, so right now we were kind of looking at what opportunities there were from just like an experimental well perspective, right? Because we are pretty early on in our process, and we want to acknowledge that we are still learning about what each of those take and what the impact is, and so on. And so the one of the initial targets were these things called class 5 salt caverns, and they were typically used for the strategic oil reserve to store hydrocarbons. And they're basically these massive underground salt formations that were, I think, initially solution brined. And then right now, what they're finding is that if they're not filled and capped properly, that they'll actually like create sinkholes and things. They're just these voids. So you constantly have to like refill them with like water or soil or something to like make them solid. And so what we are trying to do is basically fill them with bio-oil, which eventually, like I mentioned, slightly unstable from a like fuel perspective, will just solidify and just like become this like mass inside the well. There's then going into other types of formations. We're working with a lot of geologists and the consultants in different areas to figure out what is those, like doing core samples and testing on different types of formations to understand where it's best co-located. And some of the disposal wells, basically we're looking into how we can permit for those wells, and how like what is necessary and what kind of testing you have to do, monitoring, etc. And then with the dream of getting to something like a depleted oil and gas well, which we know that around the US there's just like thousands of these wells that haven't been handled and cleaned up properly, and they're just empty. And they're similar formations to any sort of industrial disposal well. And we know that they've stored oil and gas for like millions of years effectively. And so what we want to do is basically say like, okay, well, in theory, this should be able to store our bio oil in the same levels without getting into aquifers, without penetrating other formations. And then we want to have that added benefit of capping them and safely sealing them, but also utilizing all the oil infrastructure around the US to like actually just turn it and do it in reverse, and then deploy, like basically have opportunities for jobs and for the different pieces of infrastructure that would otherwise just be scrapped, and put them towards a clean energy, like clean, like new age process that is actually removing carbon as opposed to adding to the problem.
So on the product side, I mean, on the offset side in itself, I was looking at your website, and I saw that we can directly now purchase some offset from you guys. So if you could walk us through a little bit this customer experience, like how does it work, and what are maybe the challenges that you see today? I mean, what keeps you up at night?
What keeps me up at night, and how the customer, those two questions are like so materially different for me, but we'll start.
Let's start from the top one, the first one, and then let's definitely move on into the what keeps you up at night. I mean, we can take that one for later on in the,
I got
in the
both.
interview as
Yeah,
well.
we got this.
Okay.
All right, so customer experience. So we basically have a way to subscribe or just buy a purchase of our bio oil. After you sign up, you can basically do a little bit of a sizing of how much you would want to spend. We know that we're more expensive, so for a given individual, that might be just like you can't necessarily do, unless you're willing to spend a more money than average on your offsets. You don't really get to do the same thing where you like measure your tonnage and then you buy your tonnage because that's very expensive. So sometimes people just choose to buy on a tonnage basis or something, or they'll effectively just do a recurring thing where they want to like support in some way. And then once that happens, there's some contracting. We can kind of give you an example of a delivery date that would be feasible for us. And then once that carbon is put underground, you're basically like notified of that process. And depending on the amount that you choose to buy, you'll get some amount of the due diligence behind showing where that carbon is. You'll get at least a certificate that says that it was injected. But some of our bigger customers require a little bit more of the depth of technical diligence on that. So that's typically how it goes.
So let's cover a little bit the economics, and I would say the expected economics of Charm Industrial, and which is very exciting is, as you mentioned at the beginning of the interview, you guys are also like, in a way, your clients, all of those, at least those three big names that you mentioned prior, are paying the premium to, in a way, finance your growth, besides the venture capitalists on the other side. So what is the at term, I would say, in the next 3-5 years, maybe 10 years, like the business model that you see with Charm Industrial, and what are the maybe financial projection that you guys already put on the whiteboard, if everything goes according to plan?
Yeah, I think it really matters about our ability to scale the pyrolyzers effectively. And so right now we're kind of in that sweet spot, or well, Swedish, maybe not sweet, bittersweet spot of we want to do more. We know there's demand for some carbon removal, but we also need to scale our pyrolyzers, and that can only happen on timelines that hardware can be developed within, you know what I mean? So the vision of Charm, we right now have these like small pyrolyzers that are about shipping container size that go on the side of the field. We really want to develop something that looks more like a combine harvester or a tractor that goes on the field, picks up the material in the windrow, so before it gets baled, and produces bio-oil on board. And that is something that we want to be able to. We know that assembly lines have been made for these machines. We want to like follow that process. And right now it's much more of that packaging into a shipping container, bringing that shipping container to a farm, and processing the bio-oil in like an operational way. And so to be able to scale that, we need some time, and we need some commitment across the board from a lot of these companies or investors that they're on board with that process. But there is still that hesitancy around the size of the voluntary carbon markets, right? And so we don't know unless we can get some of those like purchases on really long timescales, that long offtake effectively over the next decade, to say that we have the customers who will buy it. So like now we can go put in that investment to that hardware. And so it's a bit of a balancing act with like trying to figure out how fast you should move on hardware, how much money and burn you should put into that in comparison with what you know to be available from a market and business perspective. And so what we'd like to do is get like immediately to scaling the pyrolyzers over the next few years and be able to like constantly triple or double our offsets every year. But we also need to make sure that we can pair that with proper investment at the right price points, proper deals from different companies that like show that commitment over the long term, and then also prove from a technical side that that's feasible.
So just to conclude on that aspect, you mentioned that you're around like $600 a ton for carbon offset. So what is at scale when all of those steps that you mentioned are achieved in a way? How low can you go, you think?
This is based on our like a lot of assumptions, but we're hoping to get down to like that $50 per ton range to be cost competitive with some of the nature-based offsets. It depends on unlocking a lot of regulatory markets as well. So basically, or unless the carbon removal like voluntary carbon removal space becomes a lot bigger, or the incentives become a lot bigger for customers to offset, then we would also need that kind of regulatory, like, oh, there is a cap or a cost of carbon and they have to offset it in some way to grow that market. And then we're also hoping eventually to be cost competitive with natural gas, which unlocks much more of that decarbonization opportunity from steel and other heavy industries. So that's on the order of like many more pyrolyzers, right? Like the pyrolyzers would have to become that like that commodity, that like consumer product that a farmer can own with some investment, and sell the oil back to us or to the other things. And then it would hope to be able to get down to that like $50 per ton range.
Okay, so let's go now to a more personal question. I'd like to get your personal opinion, as I ask always during the show, about the climate crisis. I mean, what would be your words to people who are like afraid of all the terrible news and already visible consequences of climate change? I mean, as I always say, are we doomed? Or what would you tell them?
I'd like to not live in a world where I feel doomed by the climate crisis. Um, I do think that we need a warlike effort to fix it, however. So, like, just me in an office in San Francisco and like my team and a couple of the small carbon companies, like, that's not going to be it. We need that like silver buckshot as opposed to the silver bullet. We need several solutions. We need a huge, massive push for electrification and for the decarbonization of heavy industry and like moving away from oil and gas into renewables. And I think the pressure needs to be on to basically we should not get jaded by the fact that we don't necessarily feel that momentum yet. And rather, like, that should encourage us to push harder on our representatives and on our governments, and then also to encourage others to get into the space and know that there's a job for you here, regardless of your background, in order to tackle this crisis. So I do think that while I don't think we're doomed. I also think that it needs a more massive effort than we're currently giving it.
So how can the community of listeners around the world can help you today?
Sorry, can you say that again?
How can the community of entrepreneurs, founders, investors listening to the show can help you today?
I would say that, encouraging everyone to keep the pressure on government in a very productive and useful way, as opposed to just thinking about it, require that they kind of meet the actual needs of some of the things that we're doing, right? We know that there's been a lot of high level talk, but not a lot of low level or like actual action on the part of expanding different like pieces of our infrastructure around the world, putting money not just towards like the concept of these grants or these like long-term projects, but really like putting money in the hands of people who can deploy it in really productive ways, and then holding accountable a lot of these other like types of laws or like types of offsets that we might be thinking are producing useful offsets for us, but not actually doing much when it comes to removing carbon. And so putting that pressure on, learning about what they can do in their different spaces of industry, and considering a move into the climate space to help the cause of removing carbon generally.
So any question that I did not ask you that I should have for this first part of the interview?
Let's see. Well, we're hiring. I guess that's towards the towards the end of that. Like, so if anyone has a skill set, Charm is hiring actively and aggressively to try to scale our processes. So I encourage people to check that out if they're interested, and also just like maybe their skill sets might be applicable in ways they don't initially anticipate.
Thank you so much, Kelly, for your time and your incredible insight on the industry. I'm so excited to see so many brilliant people like you putting so much effort towards a better and cleaner world. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and thank you for having me. It was great talking with you.
Hi, it's Guillaume again. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the show. As I said, do not hesitate to share an episode with a friend. Also, if you value the work we do for the climatetech ecosystem, here is how you can contribute to it. Today, I'm asking for your support and a donation or sponsorship to make the work of our self-funded team more viable. Even a small contribution means a lot to us. In any case, I will invite you to subscribe to our channels and visit our website startupbasecamp.org to discover more episodes like this one. And get your membership to access all our members' exclusive content. So remember, all of this is possible because of your support and donation. And we want you to be part of this collective movement against climate change. Let's keep in touch, and I hope you will enjoy our next show with us.